Well, thank you, Evan. Thanks so much for having me. Thank you all for being here today and being my guinea pigs. This is really a work in progress. So just a little bit of background. I started going to China and conducting interviews in the very early 1980s, doing work on the US-China-Soviet triangle, and got into a lot of the research institutes that at that time very few people knew existed. Folks in the US Embassy had no idea that these institutions existed. And it was a great way for me very early on to learn about Chinese thinking about the world, threat perceptions, views about the Soviet Union, and a range of security issues, and North Korea was one of them. So I've been talking with Chinese experts for many years about North Korea, and not just in Beijing and Shanghai, but also along the border. I've been up to the China-North Korea border many times talking with experts there. And as Evan mentioned, one of the projects that I'm doing now is to bring data to the subject of China's rise and Chinese power. And so my China Power CSIS.org website looks at economic, technological, military, and different soft power indices of, that relate to Chinese power, and puts them in the context, of course, of a comparison with other countries, because power is relative. And all of our data is downloadable, so it's really intended to be used for education and research purposes, and all my podcasts are online too. So I decided to bring together this sort of study of China-North Korea relations with some data. And so my team has been digging into some data in Korean, in Chinese, and in English. We have more work to do, so this is the first presentation that I'm giving, and would certainly welcome your suggestions and reactions. But before I go into it, I just want to give you a little bit of context about how I see the China-North Korea relationship, because I think it does need some context. So I would say basically there have been four enduring interests that the Chinese have had in their relationship and their policy toward North Korea. The first is certainly maintenance of peace on the peninsula. Having experienced the Korean War and paid a high price for it, China does not want to see any military conflict in North Korea. It would invite potentially intervention. If the North Koreans started a war again, or of course if the U.S. and South Korea were to start a war, and the likelihood of China getting involved would depend on the contingency. But if you look at Chinese military planning and exercises today, you can see a lot of preparations for involvement in different scenarios. And so I think the Chinese don't assume that they would not be involved in their work if there were another conflict. So the Chinese clearly do not want to see conflict on the peninsula. Secondly is to prevent a collapse of the regime, so basically preservation of stability. Instability in North Korea could invite some involvement by the U.S. and South Korea, could spill over into the border, refugees, all of those kinds of challenges. The third, I think, has been the preservation of North Korea as a strategic buffer against the possible presence of U.S. forces or a U.S.-aligned Korean state on what has been a very sensitive border for China. So my view is not that China opposes unification. It's that it doesn't want a unified Korea that's aligned with the United States on its border. So if China could actually facilitate the evolution of a unified Korea that was not aligned with the United States, I don't think that China would really have a problem with the unified Korea. Of course, how that happens is you go back to the first two interests: no conflict and no instability. And then I think the fourth is a bit more controversial, and that is support for a formerly close communist ally with strong historical ties. I think the generation that was involved in the war is basically dying out. So the old veterans that would write letters to senior Chinese leaders about preserving good ties with North Korea, I think that factor is dissipated. But of course, in Xi Jinping, you have somebody who attaches a lot of value to being a Marxist state, and the ideological factor, I think, is more important. So I don't rule out that that is still a factor in the China China-North Korea relationship, but I myself think that it's the least important of the four. So the other thing that needs to be said about China's policy towards North Korea is that it is, in the past, been primarily, I think, reactive, but like Chinese foreign policy in general, becoming much more proactive. And China wants to influence the events on the Korean Peninsula. If the ground begins to shift there, as we have seen with all of the summitry, the talk about a potential peace treaty, if there really were a fundamental change in those relationships, China wants its interests to be protected. And so China has, I think, really worked on trying to develop relationships with both Koreas. Of course, relations with South Korea having been established in 1992, but having really changed, I think, since President Park was president in South Korea. We've seen more diplomatic exchanges. We've seen more even nascent military exchanges. So I would say that China's influence over events on the Korean Peninsula are important, not only for China's interests on the peninsula, but also because the strategic orientation of Korea is pivotal in the balance of power, because it's essentially the competition between China and the United States. And I think that in large part, Chinese leaders have looked at the Korean Peninsula through that prism of potential influence in Northeast Asia and Asia more broadly. So as I look in this database and interactions between China and North Korea, they provide insights into how China manages its relationship with North Korea and how it seeks to influence developments on the peninsula. So the other thing that I just wanted to mention before I go into this, talk a little bit about China's policy towards nuclear weapons. And I haven't mentioned that as a major factor in China's policy. I think that there are some circumstances in which China might be able to tolerate nuclear weapons on the peninsula. But China's own policy has had three elements where they say no war, no instability, and no nuclear weapons. So it is part of the rhetoric. But I think that the reasons that China has opposed nuclear weapons are important to dig into. North Korea's development of nuclear weapons has led to a deterioration in the security environment for China, and has led to basically five major risks. The first is that we've seen an increase in missile defense deployments by Japan, by the United States, around China, and US-led military exercises. So a real increase in military activity in the immediate vicinity in China that is seen by the Chinese to some extent aimed at weakening China and affecting China's interests in a negative way. Second, under President Trump, I think there has been the increase in the possibility of a U.S. attack on North Korea. It doesn't look like that today, but 2017, there was a lot of fire and fury and a sense among many people that the potential for a Trump strike on North Korea was growing. Thirdly is a concern in China that other countries could go nuclear if North Korea actually becomes an accepted nuclear weapon state. So you end up with Japan, South Korea, some people say even Taiwan. The United States shut down a Taiwan nuclear program twice, so they might have an interest in developing a nuclear weapon. So that would certainly be of concern for China. Fourth would be proliferation of nuclear material, potentially to terrorists. China sees that it has its own terrorist problem, would not want to see that kind of proliferation. And then the fifth one is really interesting if you actually look into the domestic conversation in China about nuclear weapons, and that is the risk of the contamination of soil, air, water in northeast China. And where you have the nuclear test site not too far from China's border, there was the potential after the last nuclear test of a collapse of that site. A lot of discussion about contamination. Every time there's a nuclear test site, the Chinese fly aircraft and test the air quality. They test the soil quality. They want to reassure the people. This is important, of course, in part because of the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. You want to be seen as protecting your people. So as we will see in the data, China's willingness to put pressure on North Korea affects the exchanges that we're going to see. But the reason why I think China was willing to put more pressure on North Korea, there were two main reasons. Kim Jong-un's ramping up of his nuclear and missile tests that caused a lot of that increase in threat from other countries that concerned the Chinese, the potential for attack on North Korea, or again, further deterioration of China's security environment. But also the fact that President Trump basically determined that China's cooperation to denuclearize North Korea was the litmus test of the US-China relationship. And we saw this at Mar-a-Lago, where, as I was told, when Kim Jong-un when Xi Jinping sat down with President Trump, that's what they really talked about the entire time. It was about North Korea, and President Trump was explaining why he needs China's help, and China has to step up if they are going to make progress toward denuclearizing North Korea. You may remember there was a time where President Trump was saying, if China works with me on eliminating the nuclear threat from North Korea, then we can give them a better trade deal. I think that kind of thinking changed after a while, and President Trump went forward with his tariffs. But that was very important in the first year, 2017. So I think China likely calculated that putting pressure on North Korea would not cause major instability, because they would calibrate it and they would follow the stability very closely, that it might encourage Kim Jong-un to return to the negotiating table, which would stabilize things on the peninsula, that it might help improve relations with the United States and stave off this pressure on trade, and that it might enhance China's reputation as an international player. And I think that's something that's always in China's mind, is one of the things that they would like. And then the last point that I want to make is that I'm not talking about China's sanctions compliance or their non-compliance. Now, you know, there's been a long series of UN Security Council resolutions. We have a panel of experts up at the UN who are following very closely whether there are violations by every country in the UN, but China being the most important. But what is interesting to me is, in going through some of this data, you can see, particularly over the last couple of years, as first in 2017, as China really began putting these sanctions, adhering to them more strictly and supporting more serious sanctions, you can see in the data that there are certain kinds of exchanges with North Korea that end up getting curtailed. And then more recently, since that summitry has started, we have seen that there's been more reports of things like joint ventures being signed. We don't know whether they're actually executed, but that would be a sanctions violation. And so you can see a real reversal, and there's been a real uptick in the exchange between the two countries. So I'm going to go through some of this and start talking first about trade. The trade data is obviously not mine. This is Chinese customs data. You can also use the COTRA data from South Korea, but frankly, there isn't that much difference between them. But you can see the overall trade intensity here from 2005 to September of this year. And you can see a pretty steady increase in trade. There's some seasonal variation. In January, there seems to be, February, every year there seems to be less. One immediate thing you noticed, Chinese exports are far greater, obviously, than Chinese imports from North Korea. You can see that after the sanctions really begin to get more strict, which is really at the beginning of 2017 and then going through 2018, Chinese imports from North Korea decreased very, very sharply. And so if we hone in on some of this period here, this is just looking at 2017 and 2018. And so you can see how low their imports get at this point. The low of the exports, I think, was in February. Same thing with imports from North Korea. And then you see how they've begun to increase a little bit, both Chinese exports to North Korea and a little bit here also on the import side. Again, that doesn't tell you whether it's compliant with UN Security Council resolutions. That's something else. But they're probably stabilizing now at about 200 million per month. That's the exports. That's down about 50 to 100 million from where they were last year at this time. So it's a pretty significant change. But the imports is the main story here. So I want to move from here into talking about some of our data that we've put together. And what you can see here is a couple of things. First, this is when Hu Jintao comes to power, 2002, and then we have Xi Jinping comes to power. And you have 3 meetings that Hu Jintao had with Kim Jong-il. And in that period, that takes place before the first nuclear test, which is there in purple, 2006. And then you don't have any meetings between the top leaders for 4 years. Then you have this spate here. I think this is pretty much in the period where Kim Jong-il is ill and the beginning of the leadership transition. And then you don't have any more meetings here. Xi Jinping comes to power. You immediately, very shortly after that, have a nuclear test. I've only included the ICBM tests here. Those are in blue. I didn't include the short-range missile test, but you can see a spate of nuclear tests. And of course, Xi Jinping has no meeting with Kim Jong-un until this inter-Korean summitry begins. And then he has had now 3 meetings with Kim Jong-un in a very short period of time. And you can see those in green over here. That should be green. So it's interesting that you can see that Xi Jinping's management of this relationship was very different than Hu Jintao. Xi Jinping did not want to engage at a high level. I was told that when North Korea conducted the first nuclear test, that the Chinese Foreign Ministry had drafted a statement that went to the Standing Committee of the Politburo, which was to be the public statement condemning the nuclear test, and that the Foreign Ministry's language that they used was too soft, and that Hu Jintao had actually had suggested using the term hanran, to flagrantly violate it. And in that period, I think that what the top Chinese leadership was angry about North Korea's defiance of Chinese interests and wishes. Even more angry about being defied than they were about the nuclear test itself. But I think that in part led to Hu Jintao's pulling back from the relationship for some time and not really re-engaging at a high level until 2010. So then we look at what this data is meetings that Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un did not have directly with each other, but had with others. So like a visiting delegation, an envoy, an ambassador. Now we've only gone back to 2015, and there'll be more data that we'll add later on. But what you can see here, first of all, there's not many interactions. Before this period, there was a time where I think actually Kim Jong-un was meeting occasionally with the Chinese ambassador, the prior one, not who's the one who's there now. But they did have, there was some meeting in an amusement park that was reported at one point. But that's not on this particular graph. So there are very few. And it's also interesting to note this right here. I mean, this is what we have seen so far in 2018. And Kim Jong-un is meeting with visiting Chinese. So we've had some envoys, we've had some other senior leaders, and so he has met with more people than actually Xi Jinping is. So we see Kim Jong-un being more engaged in this relationship. I should also mention that all the reports that we're using are obviously, these are both countries that control the media. So it's in the media is authoritative. It's sending signals about their attitudes and their policies. So it's important that the fact that it is reported, and so we're using authoritative sources. So then we look at all of China-North Korea interactions. So this particular data set is including non-physical interactions. So that would mean gifts that are given or messages that are sent, letters that are sent, that are reported in official media. So later on, I take that part of it out and just look at physical. So we just thought it'd be interesting to look at them separately. And so in this case, you can see a couple of things. There's a fair amount of variation in the number of interactions from month to month. Again, just like in trade, you see a real drop-off at the beginning of each year. But the trend is a relative decrease over time. There's a lot more going on here in the 2012 and 2013 period than there is in more recent years. And of course, here is where beginning, it's really at the end of 2016, you have the first UN Security Council resolution that actually has a serious impact. It's requirement of reducing the oil that would be able to be purchased to be exported to North Korea, and then the amount of coal that could be imported. That, of course, then it gets expanded to include seafood and heavy machinery, and there's several very important UN Security Council resolutions in this period. So you can see that these interactions decline. And so then you get to, of course, here in April of 2018, summitry, and what happens after the summitry. And you can see these interactions beginning to pick up again. And I expect that over time, as we look at this in the next 3 months, in the next 6 months, that this will probably continue. I don't know whether it will continue to increase or whether it will just stay at a somewhat higher level than it was down here. So then what we've tried to do is look at the interactions by sector. And we've divided them into political, military, economic, health and humanitarian, sports, culture, and science and technology. And I'm still digesting this myself. So there's a lot of information up here. But a couple of things that I come away with is, first, this number is 30. There aren't that many interactions going on. This is a very controlled set of interactions that go on between China and North Korea. Now, of course, not every single thing is going to be in this data set. There are occasionally scholars that will go and it won't be reported, although sometimes if it's from a very important institute, if it's from the Academy of Sciences, it's going to get reported. If it's from the Chinese Institutes of Contemporary International Relations, because they're under the Ministry of State Security, that gets reported. So there's some of that in here. But of course, it's not capturing everything. But you can see here that there's a lot going on really in the political area and very little in the military area. So for those of you who don't follow China's military relations with the world, if you looked at US-China military relations, you would see a lot more interactions than that. Even countries like Australia. Today, China probably has more military actions with South Korea than it does with North Korea. Now, they have a friendship treaty that goes back to 1961, has a mutual defense clause. Don't know whether that would actually be applied today. But they don't do joint military exercises, and they have very few exchanges. I talk to people from the National Defense University, for example, in China, and they tell me they, at most once a year they would have a delegation that would come from North Korea, and they'd have a conversation for a few hours, and then the North Korean delegation just wants to go shopping. I mean, that's really so. But that's what you can see a very, very small number of military interactions. So this will be interesting, I think, to track over time and see whether we can learn more. We've only been able so far to go back to 2015, but we're going to take this back to 2009 as we did the other data and see. This is just pulling out of that prior graph, the economic interactions. And I think if you look at this, you can see it's been somewhat erratic, but there has been a bit of an uptick. I mean, again, you have this real decline right there. Again, that's the sanctions period, where the Chinese have become more and more compliant. And then you have the beginning of this symmetry period, and you see a real increase. So I think this graph really shows you what's going on in the economic realm. And then you can see, just looking at that information from a different perspective, breaking it out into types. So we have something like 27 to 28% of the interactions are in economics, politics, or sports and culture, and then the remaining 16.5% is composed of the other three categories. So that is just a different way of looking at the data. So then we get to the physical interaction. So by physical, this takes out the gifts and the letters and the messages and shows you from a different perspective the level of people who are interacting. So you've broken this into provincial level and below, mid-level leadership, high-level leadership, and we have very clear definitions for each of these. It's who's in what category, and heads of state. So heads of state, will not just be interactions with each other, but if they have met with an ambassador or an envoy or something like that. So again, you can see how few meetings there are at the head of state level, and a long period here where there's no head of state meeting. But the vast majority, which I guess shouldn't be surprising, the vast majority of these physical interactions is provincial and mid-level. And so you can see when there is an uptick, and again, same period, a decline when they are implementing the sanctions more strictly. And here we are once again, the symmetry begins here, and you can see a huge surge in the interactions between China and North Korea, which to some extent seems to be sustained. And we're looking at a fairly short period here. We only have data through the third quarter of this year. So my last slide, we thought we would just look at a couple of the interactions across institutions where they have parallel organizations in both countries. So the Red Cross, the Communist Youth Leagues, the Friendship Associations, and the Academies of Sciences. And you can see how many meetings they have per year. And you can see when the meetings spike, my mistake. And so you have a spike in meetings here of the friendship associations, and around the same time period, an increase in the Communist Youth Leagues. I'm really struck by the fact that these Communist Youth League exchanges stopped in 2015. And we have really, and on the Chinese side in 2014. And we've really dug into the data. It's possible that we've missed one. So if I find it, I'll correct it. But so far, we have found in 2018 no visit on either side by the Communist Youth Leagues. The Red Cross has been sort of fairly consistent. Again, you see the spike in the friendship associations. And the Academies of Sciences is sort of interesting. There's more visits by the DPRK side than there is by the Chinese side. But again, you see that decline over time and down to a very low level of 1, just increasing to 2. In fact, there was just a visit last month or 2 months ago by the DPRK to China and the Academies of Science. So that's the data set, and very interested in hearing your reactions, what you think would be interesting to look into in the future going forward, and any questions that you want to ask on China's relations with North Korea.
China may have an interest in promoting a new world order that would be more favorable toward authoritarian or autocratic regimes. like a world safe for autocracy, but also North Korea may only be willing to really denuclearize if the regime can be protected. So is there like a happy coincidence here that North Korea would be more willing to denuclearize if the world order as a whole were less threatening to autocratic regimes? And how should the United States regard that as a way that denuclearization actually could be a lever for changing world institutions to be less threatening toward authoritarian regimes, or at least be regime neutral, not so democracy promoting as the liberal world order was?
It's an interesting question. There are many contradictions from my point of view in U.S.'s approach to North Korea. There is less interest, I think, in overt regime change, although we could get there. We could adopt a policy of regime change, and our National Security Advisor, John Bolton, has in the past advocated regime change. But the North Koreans have said all along that they want to have security assurances. The truth is, we've given them a lot of security assurances that we won't attack, but I doubt there would be any circumstance in which the United States would give a security assurance to a regime that we will keep them in power. That's beyond what we're going to do. Maybe the Chinese would do that. But at the end of the day, I'm not convinced that even that kind of assurance, if they got such an assurance from China or from any other country, that that would be enough for North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons, because I think they're inextricably linked. So for North Korea, that's been pursuing this nuclear program for decades, having that nuclear weapons capability, to my mind, is part of the way that they defend themselves and keep their regime in place. So I'm very just skeptical myself that they are really willing to give it up. It's part of regime and party legitimacy and legitimacy for the Kim family. So I've always believed we should test them. We should seize any opportunity that presents itself. But I think we have to go into this with our eyes open. And I'm not sure that, again, even if we were to provide assurances about the retention of their authoritarian regime, that at the end of the day, that would be enough for them to give up their nuclear weapons. I'm rather skeptical.
Thank you for presenting today. I appreciate the kind of information that you laid out on official exchanges. I was wondering, as you mentioned that China has taken more of a global role, not just in its sphere of influence, but worldwide, is there any data set that we can look to or that would provide indication that more of these engagements have moved off of the public sphere and into the private sphere? For example, you mentioned that the Communist Youth League's meetings have stopped, essentially since 2015 up until now, and we haven't seen anything. Is there anything to suggest or any data set to suggest that these meetings or there's continued engagement at a higher level privately, backdoor diplomacy?
Not that I know of. I mean, there are some people who've tried to understand what the business interactions are between the two sides. I think John Park at Harvard has done some good work on this. Maybe Steph Haggard has also looked into this with Marcus Nolan. And that would be more at the sort of business level and trying to understand. But that would be as a result of their own interviews. So I don't know of any data set that's available.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much for coming here, and I've learned a lot from you. Your Twitter feed is excellent.
My raison d'etre of being on Twitter.
First, a comment about this Youth League chart you just talked about. I guess it probably reflects the decline of the power status of Youth League in internal Chinese politics. I mean, it's an open secret that our beloved supreme leader really despises the whole Youth League establishment.
Somebody else's faction.
Okay, so my question is, About the China, of course, the China-North Korea relationship is very complicated. But well, let's say I'm not sure if it's a communist thing or a cultural thing. But from the pure Machiavellian point of view, it would be nice for China to have someone. It has ultimate control first, and second, sometimes it makes some noise and makes some trouble to this international international order, which is underwritten by America. It would be nice to have someone like Korea. And Korea probably knows that ultimately it has to play this kind of role. So I was wondering if there is some mutual understanding there with some bottom line relationship, so both understands their ultimate role and which is not written explicitly on a piece of paper. So what do you think of that? Thank you.
My view is that when the two leaders of China and North Korea get together, they understand deeply the history of that relationship, and it's really not a very positive one. And that North Korea, and particularly Kim Jong-un, probably is not happy about the fact that he has to defer to the great, the great emperor in China, if you will. And China always looks at its relationships from the perspective of hierarchy, and sees that whether it's North Korea or even one day, in my view, a united Korea, it's still going to be a very junior neighbor. It's not a major power, and it's certainly not in China's class. So I think that the understanding between those two leaders is not quite what you suggest. North Korea is sometimes very blatantly hostile towards China. We have seen that in even very public media in the last couple of years. We cannot, at least I cannot, accept the fact that that evaporated, that hostility, just because the two leaders started meeting with each other and saying positive things. So I think there's deep suspicion by both sides. The Chinese are angry that, again, North Korea is defiant, is not listening to what China wants it to do. And I think that North Korea feels that it really can't trust China. Chinese, I think, also have always remained concerned that North Korea would align itself more closely with the United States. Now, I've heard many experts in China say that there could be a 180-degree turn in North Korea's policy, and under Trump, that is more possible, that there could somehow be this, they don't use the term alliance, but essentially an alignment, and that China would have a more hostile relationship with North Korea. And having a hostile relationship with a country on its border would be a very serious thing for China. So I don't think there is any real understanding between them. And as far as having a partner in undermining and challenging the liberal international order, Russia's a much better partner.
Thank you so much. So you got into this a little bit in the last question, but can you talk more about North Korea's interest in pursuing a relationship with China, whether or not that's been a sustained interest, or is new given China's willingness to engage with North Korea?
Well, I caveat that I focus more on the Chinese side, and I'm not a North Korea expert, but I do look at the relationship, and North Korea over. Somewhere between 85 and 90% of North Korea's trade for years has been with China. It's incredibly dependent on the Chinese and the goods that come across that border. The flood of the surge in the development of markets in North Korea, incredible amount of Chinese goods. And the amount of activity that has gone across that border has really been enormous. Right now, I think that the North Koreans, if you look at this from a current perspective, there's illegal ship-to-ship transfers going on of oil. That's taking place in the East China Sea. I've actually heard that that has recently moved closer and closer to the Chinese coastline, so that it's within their 12 nautical mile territorial sea, so that other ships or aircraft cannot easily identify the hull numbers and then point blame at China or whoever the ships might be run by. There's actually some Taiwanese ships as well that have been identified in this illegal ship-to-ship transfer of oil. So if the Chinese look the other way to the extent that they do, that's very much in North Korea's interest. And for people who track the price of gasoline and oil and look at the energy situation in North Korea, it looks like they're not hurting as much as they should, given the cap on energy that was agreed upon at the UN Security Council. So I think China is potentially playing some role in that. Xi Jinping has never come out and said, we're going to walk away from the sanctions, but I think we're seeing a little bit less strict compliance than we had, and particularly in that particular area. But if you look at it historically, North Korea had been very dependent on Russia, and after the Soviet Union, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that tie essentially evaporated. And China became the most important country for North Korea. I'm sure North Korea has resented the degree to which it has been dependent on China. And it has never extended to a real security or nuclear umbrella. As I alluded to earlier, there is a mutual defense clause that says that they would come to each other's aid. But I've been told by experts in China that the Chinese government has many times approached the North Koreans and asked them to excise that clause, but because their agreement is both sides have to agree before there's any change in the treaty, and the North Koreans have refused, and therefore the Chinese have said, well, we'll decide if there is any scenario as to whether or not we are going to get involved or come to your aid. So there's no blank check there. So even on the security side, there's a few Chinese that have advocated recently extending a nuclear umbrella to North Korea as a way in which they could give North Korea some confidence, security assurances, and encourage them to give up their nuclear weapons. But frankly, the China that I know is not extending a nuclear umbrella to anyone, least of all North Korea. So I think it's, it's not a hostile relationship, but it is one in which there's a lot of mutual suspicion, and I think resentment, particularly on the North Korean side. They want more options, and if you look at Kim Jong-un, he's doing a good job having summits with the United States, the South Koreans, as well as the Chinese. I think the Cubans were there the other day, and he may travel to Russia. So that gives him more room to maneuver and potentially makes him less reliant on it.
Thanks so much for giving us a preview of the analysis. It's just really refreshing to have data-driven analysis, especially in an area that's been traditionally more on the heavier side on political language. I'm very interested in the type of data text mining that you do here, especially in terms of the scope of the text analysis. Are you focused more on the media coverage? And if so, what type of media is included in the analysis? And especially from my knowledge of Chinese official media, in People's Daily, the section, what section that specific coverage is on matters a lot, more than just what the language uses in the text itself. The front page is very different than the A3 page, and it's very different than the D5. Would that be something in the future that could be considered as to contribute to the weight of the analysis of a particular data point in the analysis?
Great suggestion. We haven't gotten that deep yet. So we really haven't gotten into a textual analysis of the placing on the page. We've really just tried to look at the level of the person involved in the interaction, and then tried to categorize it and see what type of interaction it is. But there's a lot of potential out there to see what and differentiate, of course, not only where it is in a particular newspaper, but comparing newspapers. So at local newspapers, there's sometimes more interesting reporting about or at least more reporting about interactions. It's not always going to be in People's Daily. If we limited it to People's Daily, I'd have very little data. I mean, they don't report that much on China and North Korea, except, of course, when Kim Jong-un is meeting with Xi Jinping and it's plastered all over the front page. But to get at these other kind of interactions, we have to use all sorts of different information. And in Korean language, we find that there's often things that are not reported on the Chinese side. There's some of these interactions, like a friendship association, it's like always reported by the North Koreans, by KCNA, but it's hardly ever reported by the Chinese side.
Thank you, Ms. Glaser. So following your previous comments, my question is, do you observe any fundamental changes in the way DPRK interacting with the international community? Because we know the peninsula has been up and down, but basically like in the same manner. But it seems that in the previous 1 or 2 years, we have this Trump and Kim Jong-un meeting, we have the North-South meeting. So do you think there's any fundamental changes in the way DPRK performs? And also, because you mentioned that the DPRK is probably playing the game, like playing the balance game between China, between Russia and the US. So do you think China's going to be irritated by this game and intervene with DPRK's policy? So like if DPRK really turns further from China and form a kind of quasi-alliance with Russia or US, what level of intervention should we expect from China? And does China still have the power to alter DPRK policy at this time? Thank you.
Well, if North Korea actually had a closer relationship with the United States that was at China's expense, which I think is highly unlikely, the tool set that China has to try and punish North Korea is pretty big. I don't think they would resort to military intervention. And we see this tool set of coercion and pressure being used against quite a large number of countries. So we've seen it used against Japan, South Korea, the Philippines. Most recently, I've seen some signs with even Malaysia. And right now, I don't have data, but Chinese tourists to North Korea are surging. Most recent report I heard from somebody is that you can't get on a tour group for the next 6 months. They're all booked up. For people who are paying attention to the Chinese flight, that used to go, it went twice a week, I think, from Pyongyang to Beijing. And then during this period of the strictest sanctions compliance, which was really sort of late 2017 and early 2018, they suspended those flights completely. So what happened after Kim Jong-un met with Xi Jinping? Those flights resumed. So, and most of there are two kinds of tour groups. There's the flights or trains that go to Pyongyang, and then there's the day trips that just go across the border. But if you look overall, there's just been this surge in tour groups. So that's something the Chinese can cut off, and this is useful revenue for the North Korean regime. So my point is just that there's a whole lot of ways that China can signal its dissatisfaction to countries, and it's fairly effective at doing that. It's not always successful. It's effective in conveying its signals. I would argue in the South Korean case, where the Chinese wanted the South Koreans to remove the THAAD missile deployment, although they did not succeed in getting it removed, they did succeed in getting some promises to have them not deploy more THAAD batteries. Or not network the missile defense systems in the region. And that's what was really of concern to China. So they have a fair high degree of confidence, I think, that they can use the economic and other levers that they have against countries. My guess is that they would use those against North Korea. When the Chinese have talk with the North Koreans. We don't know, of course, what has gone on in the Xi-Kim meetings, but there's some indications of some things that I think China has gotten what it needs. And I will cite one example. And my point here is that when China prioritizes something and Xi Jinping says, I need this, he might get it. because North Korea is dependent to a large extent on China. One thing I didn't mention is the oil that goes through the pipeline from China to North Korea. By the way, the Chinese don't include that oil in their customs data. They used to. It used to be public. The North Koreans don't pay for it. So I think it was about 7 or 8 years ago that was just taken out of the data altogether. But the example that I wanted to cite was when Kim and Xi Jinping had their first meeting. Kim Jong-un had just said before that, or the North Korean government, that they wanted, that they signaled that they would suspend missile and nuclear testing, but that it was okay if the US continued its military exercises with South Korea. You know, somehow they signaled this was understandable. Well, China had long had a policy of dual freeze. So it was freezing of the nuclear tests, right? And the freezing of the missile. So I think that was a real loss of face for Xi Jinping. And I'm pretty sure that Xi Jinping suggested to Kim Jong-un, put that back on the agenda because that's our policy. We want to be successful. Sure enough, he did, right? And then China subsequently said our dual freeze policy was successful. So that's an example where I think that was raised at the highest level, and Xi Jinping got what he needed. Another example might be the agreement to shut down the test site. So I talked earlier about their concern about contamination of air, water, and soil, and the potential for real collapse of that test site. And North Korea did agree to shut that down, and invited. It was originally, I guess, supposed to be inspectors or experts, but ended up just being reporters. We have not seen more nuclear tests there. We don't know whether the test site might, in fact, still be usable. We don't know. There's been some indications he might allow inspectors in. But the Chinese wanted that shut down. And I wouldn't be surprised if that was an ask, and he got it because he needed that for security reasons. So that's my own speculation from watching this relationship, that I think that both sides get the priority things that they need from each other.
So I grew up on the Yalu River. And
Oh, really?
Yes. So every time I go back, there's more and more Korean signage. What is the current state of human movement between the two countries? What are the ramifications of conflict arising into a possible refugee crisis? And what is China doing to prepare for that kind of a possibility?
That is such a great question. I don't know if anybody tracks human movement across the border. It's very difficult to track. I mean, I have been up there and talked with Chinese experts who work with female North Korean refugees. So this was probably about maybe 6-7 years ago. And the concern that she had, which was really an important concern, was that a refugee, these women came over to China, they got married, and then they didn't get hukou, and neither did the children. And so, in order to be able to go to school, have access to other privileges, they needed at least to be able to have that residence permit. And so she was working on trying to get the central government to do that. And so at that time, she had some interesting data herself on the number of sort of women, and it was mostly women. I don't know if that's changed. I think there are periods when North Korea is very strict about allowing or disallowing people from crossing the border. And there are certainly occasional incidents of people getting shot. There was a picture just the other day of somebody getting arrested who supposedly had been somebody who had for years been, taking bribes and helping people to get across the river. So I don't know if anybody really tracks the numbers. There's a lot of preparation in China for the possibility of a refugee crisis. And so you have people who are in the health area who have been prepared, and two friends of mine, Drew Thompson and Carla Freeman, some time ago, this could even be 10 years ago, they went around to hospitals in the area and talked to them about refugees without saying North Korean refugees. But they learned a lot about some of the preparations that are being made. I think the Chinese also may have drawn some lessons from what happened over on the Burmese side, where you had thousands of refugees spill over into China. So they are making those kind of preparations. And they're also making military preparations. They used to just exercise shutting down the border. But there's a whole lot more than that going on now. And there'll be an interesting paper coming out by the RAND Corporation, and I read it because I was one of the readers, but it's now finished, and I think within the next few weeks will be published. That looks as a fabulous chapter analyzing Chinese military exercises along the Korean border, including some of the ones they've done with Russia, which suggests the potential for Russian-Chinese cooperation in the event of some contingencies, which is really interesting since the United States has been trying to talk to China about potential contingencies along that border and gotten nowhere for years, but there seems to be some cooperation at least going on with the Russians. That the Chinese may plan to create their own refugee camps inside the Chinese border, or in some scenarios, they might actually create it across the border inside North Korea. And that report actually talks about what those circumstances would be. But if they had very, very large numbers and they were worried about those refugees getting into China or not having the capacity to care for them, they may want to keep them on the other side of the border. One thing I didn't mention that I'm sure you know very well, I don't know what the actual number is today, but it's more than 1 million ethnic Koreans that live in that area. And I think the Chinese leadership has to worry that at least some of those people, who knows how many, might have some allegiance to Korea. And so that, again, becomes, I think, a legitimacy, threat to the Chinese Communist Party. So they have to be prepared to take care of people if they actually come across the border. So there's a lot of factors that I think, when I first started looking into this, I don't think people in China were really beginning to prepare for it all. But there's a lot of evidence over the last 5-10 years that they've built capacity, they've thought through contingencies, and they're very well prepared.
I wonder, how do you think the U.S. and China trade war influence the interaction between China and North Korea, and is that reflected in the data?
In President Trump's mind, these two issues are linked. He has very clearly said that they are linked. They may not be linked anymore, or he may once again try to get China to do something on North Korea. We're having consultations on Friday with Secretary Pompeo and Secretary of Defense Mattis with their counterparts Yang Jiechi and Wei Fenghe. I'm sure Secretary Pompeo is going to be talking to Yang Jiechi about North Korea. I doubt in his mind that these think that it's linked to trade. But in the background, because the president has made that linkage, potentially it could come back. But my perspective is these are very different issues that shouldn't be linked.
I know you're asked for China, so I was wondering, you were mentioning there will be a United Korea, you believe, right? So what do you think of maybe a united China in the future, the Great China and Taiwan? And then, I don't remember what my question is, but and some people are thinking with Xi changing the constitution, some part of he want to make sure he can make a united China within his power, in his term. So I was wondering your opinion about that. Thank you.
Clearly, at least from an image or optical perspective, it is very important for any Chinese leader to say that Taiwan will someday be returned to the motherland. I think a lot of Chinese people feel that Taiwan is part of China and should be reunited with China. I think generally the people of Taiwan, particularly younger generation, they've grown up under a very different system. They like having, the right to go make trouble and protest in the streets and criticize their government, which they do every night on television, and everybody sits and watches it, and have access to freedom of information and all of that. And so if one day the situation on the mainland changed fundamentally, I would not rule out that there would be a different relationship between the two sides of the strait. But right now, I think given the direction of the way things are going in mainland China, I don't see any prospect for near-term solution of that problem. I think it's something we have to manage. I think both sides have to manage it. It's primarily their problem, the two of them. It's the U.S. has a historical relationship with Taiwan, but we've never had a policy of opposing unification. It's always been allowing the people to peacefully sort of work out their differences. And I think from Xi Jinping's perspective and the 19th Party Congress, he equated national rejuvenation, the Chinese dream, with reunification of the country in Taiwan. So some people have interpreted that as meaning there's a deadline now for unification. When I talk to people I think are authoritative in Beijing and ask them that question, they say, oh, no, he did not mean to set a deadline. It was just a statement that, of course, there must be reunification sometime in the future. But then somebody else I asked, and the answer that I got was, well, Xi Jinping won't be around then, so who knows?
Given how closely you've been watching and interacting, how is actually policy regarding North Korea in terms of organizations and key individuals being made, especially in view of the restructuring, the establishment of the NSC, the restructuring of the military, and also the state security as well, right? So a lot of reshuffling of the organizations and so on. What's your observation on how they actually work or don't work together, especially on North Korea?
That's a really interesting question, and one that I wish I had better insight into, because there are these different parts of the system that have different roles to play. We know the PLA is one, state security, probably public security. The international department, I think, still remains in the lead, even though there was a time when the Chinese said, oh, we're going to normalize this relationship, and basically the foreign ministry will be in the lead, but that's like never happened. So it's really, it's the Zhonglianbu that manages the relationship. So it's really between the two parties. But I've never been able to learn enough about the National Security Commission to know what the balance is between internal security and external security, let alone the balance among the different external security issues. There have been times I've talked to people who work there who have said, oh, they're paying attention to Japan, which really surprised me, or they're playing a role in the US-China relationship, but never could identify what that role really was. And so I don't know. Even today, I mean, it's nothing, certainly nothing like our system. It's not a national security council that's, in my view, playing a coordinating role with the others subordinate to it. It almost looks to me like another Lingdao Xiaozu, if you will, a leading small group. But I've not been able to get enough insight into that. But there's only a few things that have been written on the national security. Mike Lampton has probably written the best stuff, and even that, it already feels outdated, and I don't think anybody has been able to get into it on an issue-by-issue basis. I used to learn an awful lot from doing interviews in China. It's harder now. It's a lot harder.
Oh, my question is just, you mentioned that there's at least some fear on the Chinese side that North Koreans could do 180 degrees or like a realignment towards the world. So, I mean, what are the pitches that President Trump has to sort of entice the North Koreans that are realistic? Because he's not going to, take troops out of South Korea. What are sort of the carrots that he has to sort of sort of drive a wedge or just try to bring the North Koreans closer to the United States?
Again, I have to sort of caveat that just by saying that if we enter down that path, what I envision is we make all these concessions and the North Koreans pretend to give up this or that and end up keeping their nuclear weapons. So I think this is fraught with problems, and I think the North Koreans are very good at taking advantage of those that they negotiate with and getting what they want. So that's the caveat. But the real thing that will get, if anything will get this negotiation to at least step one, it will be the easing of sanctions. That is what North Korea wants. I think even though there's been a lot of leakage and there may be oil that's coming from these illegal ship-to-ship transfers, there's still a lot of sanctions that continue to be in place that are really, really worried. There's no coal going from North Korea out. There's very, very little. It's mostly the illegal transfers, as I've been told, it's mostly oil. So the ability of North Korea to get hard currency, that's still problematic. And North Korean laborers, getting them, they used to be all over China, Russia, and other places. That's still remains pretty small numbers. That they're having trouble with that. Exports of seafood. There's a lot of seafood you can eat in North Korea apparently now because they're exporting less of it. So I think ultimately, he would just like to see the sanctions eased in the end of the sort of maximum pressure campaign. And then, what does he get for that? And that's where you get into this very difficult period of, do we just accept the dismantlement of Yongbyon, where the plutonium program has been, is that good enough? Is that a first step? And then what do we do after that? At what point do we insist on getting inspectors in? Would we just do it for that facility? Do we insist on a declaration of all of their nuclear and fissile material, across the whole nuclear programs? There's a lot of facilities, including, of course, underground. We will never get 100%, but is there a point at which North Korea will even give us a declaration? We had a deal under the previous administration to get a declaration and never got one. So that's ultimately a path that we could start going down, give them some sanctions easing. They give us Yongbyon, we have inspectors go there, they give us a declaration. And some people think we should not insist on a declaration too early because it could kill the entire process. So rather than be a confidence builder, it could be a confidence breaker because it's likely to be a very incomplete declaration. And then many people would say, oh, but we know there's that facility over there and they didn't declare this one over there, and so they're not trustworthy. And so some people say that should be further down at towards the end of a process. But there are lots of roadmaps you could draw up, but right now we're not even at square one, in my view. I don't see the Singapore Declaration as having even gotten us on the first step. So we really haven't started negotiations. So once again, I'm skeptical, but I always think we should be testing the opportunities and see if Kim Jong-un actually wants to engage in a process that his father did not. I know. You made me end on that note.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.